luego tomar asiento. We're up to start. Please take your seats. Muy buenos días. Buenos días. Bienvenidos a Costa Rica, a todos los que vienen de otros países. Espero que hayan tenido y saboreado nuestro cafecito tico. Good morning, everybody. Honorables ministros y oficiales de Estado, también presidentes y vicepresidentes de empresas privadas. Tenemos acá representantes de asociaciones, organismos internacionales, también academia, medios de comunicación. Mi nombre es Lenda Umaña, periodista internacional. Yo les voy a estar acompañando estos 2 días y estoy muy contenta porque la verdad que como periodista me apasiona y voy a aprender muchísimo de ustedes. Estamos en la 10ª conferencia regional Crecer sobre contabilidad y auditoría para el crecimiento económico regional, y la verdad que esta conferencia se ha convertido ya en una iniciativa emblemática para conocer, para aprender, para promover la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas en la región. Y la conferencia, como ustedes saben, de este año tiene como tema principal la rendición de cuentas para maximizar lo que son las finanzas para el desarrollo. Así que durante 2 días, ustedes, muchos de ustedes, expertos del sector público, privado, de organizaciones multilaterales y de la academia, van a estar hablando, van a estar dialogando sobre cómo una mayor transparencia y rendición de cuentas puede contribuir a que nuestros países aprovechen mejor los recursos financieros disponibles y, por supuesto, lo más importante, fomentar un mejor clima de inversión privada para alcanzar los objetivos de desarrollo. Este evento queremos informarles a todos y saludamos a los que nos están viendo ya en directo a la región y al mundo por las redes sociales. Buenos días a todos ustedes también a través del Facebook Live del Banco Mundial y por Twitter en @Banco Mundial LAC, @Banco Mundial LAC. También les informamos a todos los que lo deseen, pueden sumarse a la conversación en redes sociales a través de la etiqueta hashtag numeral Crecer2019. Los que nos están viendo en vivo, les contamos que ustedes pueden enviar sus preguntas al hashtag Crecer2019. Recordarles que esta conferencia es organizada por el Banco Mundial, también por el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, la Federación de Contadores IFAC y el Comité Global de Políticas Públicas GPPC. Bueno, vamos a comenzar la conferencia y para mí es un honor presentarles a Rocío Aguilar Montoya. Ella es nuestra ministra de Hacienda, la ministra de Hacienda de Costa Rica. Ella está a cargo del Ministerio de Hacienda desde mayo de 2018, hace un poquito más de un año, acaba de cumplir. Y antes fungió como superintendente general de entidades financieras, también fue contralora general de la República de Costa Rica entre el 2005 y 2012 y tiene experiencia en diversos cargos en instituciones bancarias y en supervisión del sistema financiero. Además, ha sido reconocida por su gran labor, extraordinaria labor, por medios costarricenses como el personaje y la figura pública en los años 2008, 2009 y 2018. Es un honor para mí presentarles, para comenzar, a la ministra Rocío Aguilar Montoya.
Muy buenos días, señora Seynabou Saco, directora del Banco Mundial para Centroamérica, señora Verónica Zavala, gerente del Departamento de Países Bajos, Países de Centroamérica, Haití, México, Panamá y la
and
República
the
Dominicana
Dominican
del Banco
Republic of the
Interamericano de
IDB,
Desarrollo, señor Inky
Mr.
Yu,
Inky
presidente
Ju,
de la Federación
President of the
Internacional de
International
Contables,
Federation of Accountants,
funcionarios, formadores de políticas,
representatives,
diputados,
policymakers, private sector,
representantes
representatives of multilateral financial institutions, regulators, leaders of the civil society, academicians, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the government of Costa Rica and the Ministry of Finance, I'd like to thank you for your presence here. You are all welcome. It's for me a true pleasure to share with you today in the conference Crecer2019 that in this 10th edition focuses on accountability to maximize public finance for development. We hope these 2 days promote active learning and exchange of knowledge that will facilitate dialogue, discussion, sharing experiences, as well as the dissemination of extraordinary ideas and best practices in accounting, auditing, fiscal, and financial reports. All of this
política económica y el fortalecimiento institucional numérica y económica de Costa Rica. Costa Rica acaba de atravesar una reforma fiscal importante de alto calado
reform
que
that
hoy día nos tiene aquí realmente soñando cómo hacer cada vez más eficiente y evitar un ajuste importante para Costa Rica. Creo que el año
I think
2019 será un
2018
año consolidado
will
para
be an
Costa Rica.
unforgettable year
A
for
cada vez
everyone.
que
Hand in
realmente
hand with
hacemos
this,
esfuerzos
and for several years, our
los
country
esfuerzos
has been
grandes
making
que
important and
estamos
relevant efforts
ingresando
to
o avanzando en el
move
proceso de
forward in
adhesión
the
a
accession
la
process to
Organización
the
de América
OECD.
del Norte. Esto no ha sido un
And this
proceso
hasn't
fácil.
been easy,
Esto nos ha
and this will
permitido
allow us in
el poder mejorar y adoptar las mejores prácticas que a nivel internacional en diferentes áreas permitirán a Costa Rica que se posicione en un punto ideal para la inversión, tema que será uno de los temas centrados este año. Este es un proceso que requiera de integración de ese de 21 comités y que esperamos poderosamente empezar
21
en el
committees and that we hope to successfully conclude in 2020. Our interest is to continue promoting strategies and institutional agreements that are necessary to improve
transparencia y rendición de cuentas
transparency and
en el sector
accountability
público.
in the public sector. And precisely in order to talk about accountability, we need to take into account that it's a process that we will hardly escalate if we don't surpass the challenge
De metodologías que evalúen de manera integral la gestión del gasto público y en particular el modelo de gestión para resultados en el desarrollo. Es uno de los temas que está en la agenda prioritaria del Comité de Evaluación. En este contexto,
Within this context, the President of the Republic has declared this event of public interest. And this is a great opportunity for us to promote dialogue, as I've mentioned, mostly with public policies and how they can contribute to maximize finance while promoting the
facilitar esas finanzas públicas convierte cada vez en un reto más complejo, considerando que la participación del ciudadano, por más y mejores que existan políticas, son un apretado solvente a recursos públicos que no crecen en esa misma proporción. Y precisamente cuando nos referimos a desarrollo, esto significa
development. This goes beyond the classic concept of mere
impuestos.
that, of
Es
course,
necesario no hacer esto siempre para que el país
for
logre
the country to be able to overcome the structural gaps that limit, for some time now, the achievement of an economy and society that is much more inclusive. For no one here is a secret that development, economic and social development of the country
necesita de los esfuerzos mancomunados del gobierno y del sector privado. El problema es que en algunas ocasiones olvidamos que esto debe ser conjunto y no la suma de esfuerzos individuales. Efectivamente, deben ser alianzas, deben
be
ser
partnerships, and they have to be partners in the search of further growth and better solutions to the country. Maximizing public finance for development implies that governments take advantage of their resources and that they can engage and leverage
seja realmente usado.
la cooperación internacional debe fomentar sinergias y también esfuerzos muy equilibrados en todas las alianzas que hay para
the areas necessary, good connection between the public and the private sector to achieve these objectives. This, of course, is particularly important for Latin America. After the 2008 crisis, the fiscal space in most of our countries was significantly reduced. In many cases, the measures used to take care of the crisis were counter-cyclic rather than being temporary. Actually, we lived the effects of these measures, and they made public expenses even if they generate an effect in the short term, they compromised the possibilities of further growth. As I mentioned, we were not the exception, and this trend was not something that we began in 2009. In the case of Costa Rica, it was a trend that started out after the crisis of the 80s. This low investment in public works should be a priority in any regional development agenda. The investment in infrastructure doesn't only allow for an increase in productivity, but also it generates a positive impact in human development as a result of the access to many also among the underlying aspects to create this environment that will allow us to attract stakeholders from the private sector so that we together offer integral and inclusive growth. This private participation requires, among others, legal way we're going to be able to generate the right climate for investment. This conference, in this context, is a regional initiative geared at improving the funding of the private sector in order to strengthen growth in an environment of financial will allow us to finish these 2 very intensive days with better opportunities to implement in each one of our countries. This activity, of course, apart from being nourished from the knowledge of international experts, out of these recommendations the environment of each one of our countries. Let's take advantage of this activity so that we present the actions that will assist us to move in this direction of better spaces for development. I'm confident that it's going to be a great opportunity to contribute.
Sabemos que os frutos serão para o
Regional development. Once again, I'd like to welcome you again, and on behalf of the Ministry of Finance and Costa Rica, I'd like to wish you a very productive day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Minister. Now we're going to listen to the words of Sina Usako. She's the director of the World Bank for Central America. She's originally from Senegal and supervises the programs and technical cooperation programs for funding and studies of the World Bank in Central
Desenvolvimento econômico. É uma honra apresentar-lhes a senadora.
Distinguished Minister of Finance, Rocio Aguilar, representative of the local global partners and regional of Crecer, and in particular, my dear Veronica Zavala and Inki Ju, members of the private sector and the civil society, auditors and accountants, regulators in the financial sector, investors, institutional investors, and everyone that is joining us today. It is a true pleasure to be here today in Costa Rica to open this conference of Crecer 2019 on accountability.
porque sem investimento privado,
it's not going to be possible to reach the development objectives in a sustainable fashion in infrastructure while limiting climate change to 2 degrees. And I think this is our challenge. Secondly, it's important because transparency is essential to attract private investment and promote economic growth of the countries and generate the employment that we need. So it's a core issue to any development agenda. Secondly, why is it so important to attract private investment? First off, because we know that in Latin America and the Caribbean, public investment has averaged just around 3.3% of the GDP. In the last decade, when we know that this GDP
¿Qué requiere el sector privado? La inversión privada requiere entornos transparentes, requiere marcos de rendición de cuentas más fuertes, para así generar mejor confianza de los ciudadanos, pero también de los mercados. Y eso es la raison d'être de crecer.
of knowledge, learning, dialogue, debate, and exchange to disseminate global policies. This means that today we will be looking at Crecer2019.
trabalhar para uma melhor governança é trabalhar para os mais pobres, que são os mais afetados pela
La falta de transparencia son los más afectados por las sombras. ¿Por qué? Porque sabemos que cada dólar, cada colón, cada centavo que se pierde en corrupción es un dólar, un colón, un centavos que se deja de invertir en educación básica, en atención médica,
en acceso a agua potable.
and
Y eso
access to
es que
drinking water and
quitarlo
medical attention.
las poblaciones
And
especialmente más
this affects the most vulnerable population, which is taking away their right for a better future. This is what we'll be discussing today. And with this in mind, and the efforts that I'm sure, together with the governments, the private sector, and the civil society, we will continue working on for a more prosperous and transparent region. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Vamos a escuchar las palabras
So
de
now we're
la
going to listen to
ella
La
es
señora Verónica.
Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo para Centroamérica.
IDB for Central America, Haiti, Panama, and the Dominican Republic as well. She's originally from Peru, and she's been the representative of the IDB in Mexico and the Andean countries, planning manager and director for Peru. Also a manager in the World Bank for the public sector in Latin America. Veronica Zavala, you have the floor. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to say hello to the distinguished table I was in. Madam Minister, that we all support for her courage for working on the fiscal plan. Sinabu Sako, a person that has worked in the region, the president of the IFAC, Inki Ju, that represents over 3 million accountants around the world. And in general,
Sobre un evento tan importante para nuestros países. Como bien decían antes que me tocara a mí conversar, el financiamiento y el rol que pueden jugar las instituciones y prácticas de rendición de cuentas para
play to solve structural problems in the region is something that goes unnoticed because they're not at the forefront in public works. They're not there when funding is signed, but they're in all of this area that is required for these topics to move forward. I'd also like to say hello to and congratulate for the 10 years of Crecer. 10 years is said easily, but it's not little time when each year consolidates itself as a benchmark for a region that requires institutions and the participation of each one of you in thinking about solutions. And along this line, I'd like to
en el fortalecimiento de la agenda de gobernanza y de transparencia. Además, Crecer hace bien algo que nos es esquivo muchas veces en la región, que es juntar el punto de vista privado y público para mirar una temática. Esto es algo que realmente tiene un valor enorme, como es el caso
as is the case of our partners in the IDB, is to improve lives. And we're very happy this year of celebrating our 60th anniversary. And we're doing it very proudly for being a committed partner. Our public and private aspects, we see accountability as a cornerstone to guarantee that projects have the impact they promised when we designed them, to be sure that what we wanted to do is finally taking place, and otherwise to find out why it's not happening. And in this regard, it's a contribution on funding, but development and knowledge as well. We're clear that in these 60 years that have elapsed in our life, our role has dramatically changed. We were the funders before. Today, we're oftentimes more than funders. the ones that leverage development. And we need to work in a more integrated fashion with other partners in development and with the private sector. Look paired with our partners in development. What do I mean by this? At the IDB group last year, we talked about $17 billion. We're really happy to having placed 13 billion to support the private sector and over 4 billion in the private sector. And this sounds very good. Up until we realize, and Senabu, who's very good at numbers, is that the gap is much bigger. In the best case scenario, we put need, in this case, very clearly the private sector. In this regard, our goal is not only to do good projects and fund them, but instead to generate the conditions to attract the resources that will allow for these investments to bridge the gap in infrastructure that some estimate in 1.5 to 3 of the GDP, and this is a lot of money. We're talking not only about investments in traditional sectors such as transportation, water, and energy, but also in new areas where if we don't invest now, the region accountability and design mechanisms that will allow us to funnel this private investment generating results. For institutional strategy, and it has to be because if we don't have good systems, it's going to be very difficult to attract private investment. National systems in these topics. And a specific example is the improvement of public procurement and new technologies, such as the implementation of blockchain for procurement, so that any modification gets stored and that we know how projects evolved. Did the accounting department of the General Controller's Office in the integrated system of public procurement, CCOP, in these areas. In these tasks, I insist technology can assist us to bridge the knowledge gap, to be able to give the comfort that is needed to attract more partners.
Along this line, we have to come up to date the public and private sector on topics such as big data, data mining, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, because these elements are more and more necessary and useful for the management of public policy and the relationship between the public and private. These elements of transparency, accountability are very important.
dato han quitado varios puntos al crecimiento del país y lamentablemente este es un caso en el que Perú no está solo, hay muchos otros países en esa línea.
In this too. But I would like to finish with on a positive note. I think that this activity is a unique opportunity to be able to identify actions that from our different roles, the roles we are in charge of, can actually set the value for better accountability both at the public and private level in the region, and to define mechanisms that allow us to trigger the funds that are necessary for this robust growth, which in turn is necessary to improve citizens' lives in the region. Thank you very much for this opportunity of being with you today.
Muchas gracias a la señora Verónica.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veronica Zavala. This is the time to listen to Dr. Inki Ju, President of the International Federation of Accountants, IFAC. He is from South Korea and he became the chair of IFAC last year in November after being a vice chair for some time. Before that, Mr. Hu was president of the Korean Association of Accountants and chair of the Business Management Association and president of
Pacífico, esto fue entre los años 2009 y 2011. Le damos la bienvenida al señor Kim Ki-yu.
señora Rocío Aguilar.
Country Director for Central America, World Bank, and Veronica Zavala, Manager, Central America, Haiti, Mexico, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, Inter-American Development Bank, and also Stephen Ellis, Principal Government Affairs, KPMG Representative, GPPC. What a great time to be an accountant, living in an era of disruption. Changes is everywhere, waiting for us to harness it. I'm really pleased to be here on my first trip to this region. I am very excited to see that this beautiful country, Costa Rica, and learn more about this regional profession. This event reminds us of the potential for accountants, supported by dynamic professional accountancy organizations, educators, and researchers to grow, to innovate, and to positively impact people's lives. As a professional accountant, we have our fingers on the pulse of business requirement and change. We have the ability and skills to be nimble and agile in the face of change. As I consider Crecer's focus this year on accountability and finance development, I see two significant opportunities where professional accountants and public finance managers can maintain their competitive edge. First, we need to renew our focus on education and knowledge during the fourth industrial revolution. And second, we need to build trust and ethics. We are living during a period where the lines between our physical, digital, and biological worlds are blurring with unprecedented speed and scope. This has important implications for the way humans live, work, and to relate to each other. It has also immediate and deep implications for the accountancy profession. At the most basic level, we must embrace technology if we are to continue and prepare next generation talent for the world of work. I must declare at this point an intense interest in education. When not on IFAC business, I am a professor of accounting in South Korea. I have seen directly how accounting education has evolved greatly. Teaching and helping students explore the theory and the practice of accounting is my true passion. As a child, I remember how poor my country was after the Korean War. It was so poor that chocolate was luxury. I still remember that the first time I saw and tasted M&M chocolate candy. For me, it was very precious. It was so delicious that I couldn't forget the taste. South Korea has since become one of the fast-growing countries in the world. It is now an OECD member and also a G20 country. One key reason for this rapid economic growth is our passion for education and knowledge. Investing in education provided the brain power to drive South Korea's strong national focus on research and development. As this fueled our economy, as we exported increasingly valuable high-tech products to the world. In this story, I see many similarities with today's accountancy profession and its role in maximizing finance and economic development. And just as it did to the South Korean economy, technology is helping drive the accountancy profession further up the value chain. Lower value work is being automated, leaving accountants to be more productive, strategic business advisors. But for the accountancy profession's continued sustainability, we must search for new talent peoples and assess our current system's capability to train accountants of the future. We must recognize that the future talent must not come with just a traditional accounting degree, and we must continue incorporating different fields and knowledge. We must also consider what soft skills are necessary to move the profession forward. We cannot only be numbers people. These are challenges for our profession and also for each of us. There are also considerations for you as your region takes steps to implement and monitor continuing professional development. Adopting and implementing education standards will make clear that Latin America is ensuring a future-ready profession. Accounting education isn't only about the university degree. That is the first, of course, it's a very significant step, but only the beginning of our journey. Today, the profession is at the cutting edge of some of the world's most exciting new technologies. And in modern times, we have always stood for the public interest. We stand for the public interest in ways that are relevant, timely, and appealing to the talented young people we need to fuel our profession and our future. Accountancy profession plays a critical role in building strong and sustainable economies, but we cannot do it without good people. To attract them, we must reflect their passions and their desires. Modern agile education training systems are critical. From there, we must offer career opportunities that enable them to carry their spirit of innovation from the classroom to the boardroom. Careers and opportunities that enable them to apply technology-based solutions to critical issues. I will now turn to my second point, building trust and ethics. Arguably, there has never been a more important time for global accountancy profession to highlight our commitment to ethical conduct. Fraud and corruption are the impediment to global economic growth. They cost the global economy more than $2 trillion every year. Professional accountants are uniquely placed to help support the fight against fraud and corruption. Of course, it is a fight that we cannot win alone. An IFEC study released in 2017 showed the success is amplified when accountants operate in jurisdictions with strong institutions. For example, accountants working in Organizations for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD member countries, with stronger oversight institutions, were shown to have better outcomes in the fight against corruption. Fighting corruption requires strong national governance architectures and a strong accountancy profession. It also requires three things: continued strong cross-sector collaboration, increased adoption of high-quality international standards on financial reporting, auditing, and ethics, and renewed international interest in public financial management, including accrual accounting and international public sector accounting standards adoption. And of course, the accountancy profession's own code of ethics is at the core of the profession's public interest mandate. The revised and restructured Code of Ethics from the International Ethics Standard Board of Accountants, the ESBA, becomes effective in mid-June. The new code is also accessible and understandable. It will help accountants live and breathe code's fundamental principles. On the public sector front, improving public sector financial management is key to building trust. It drives economic health and provides greater public confidence in government finances. Accrual accounting, specifically international public sector accounting standards, IPSAS, are the linchpin for a transparent, accountable public sector. 3/4 of OECD countries have adopted accrual accounting for government year-end reports, although only 1/4 prepare annual budget on an accrual basis. More than 1/3 that have adopted accrual accounting use IPSAS as a primary or explicit reference for developing their own national standards. The Latin America region has progressed IPSAS adoption tremendously in recent years. In fact, you are one of the regions leading the progress. Key component of this success is the Government Accounting Forum of Latin America, which drives cooperation to overcome implementation issues. It is also an example of a successful partnership between the profession and governmental authorities. While adoption and implementation journey is not yet complete, it is well on its journey. Professional accountants can work directly to support sustainability and fight corruption. All of these aspects, alongside global standards that inform our work, including our code of ethics, mean we stand for something very important and precious. We build trust and inspire confidence in the broader community and throughout the global economy. Since the invention of double entry bookkeeping, we have always stood for the financial transparency. As Jacob So mentioned in his book, The Reckoning, for any country, including Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the French Empire, when they kept public financing and its bookkeeping transparent, the country flourished. But when they intentionally ignored them, the country started failing. Today, we have talked about the importance of education and knowledge in the fourth industrial revolution. We also talked about the importance of building trust and ethics in the pursuit of the public interest. Relevant education and training, building trust are the key words to attract future talent to the profession and any organization. And attracting future talent to the profession is critical for the profession's continued sustainability. This conference has brought together people who are passionate about our future and also who believe in accountancy capability to make a positive change. It's never been a great need for the skills of accountants in society. Together, we will build future-ready profession. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias al señor Hu.
Thank you very
Vamos
much,
ahora
Dr.
a
Hu.
presentar a
Now I
nuestros
would like to
invitados
introduce Mr. Stephen Ali, Director of Government Affairs of KPMG, and representation of the Global Committee of Public Policies, GPPC. He comes from the U.S. and he is in charge of KPMG, that is in charge of sustaining and continuous data policies for the protection of investors and integrity of the capital markets. I give you Mr. Stephen Alice.
Good morning. The 6 international accounting networks that make up the Global Public Policy Committee are pleased and proud to partner once again with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and IFAC in supporting Crecer. And we are deeply grateful to the government of Costa Rica, the Ministry of Finance, the Comptroller General, and the Institute of Chartered Accountants for hosting us this year in your beautiful country. We formed the GPPC as a forum for the large global accounting organizations to engage with stakeholders, investors, policymakers, regulators, standard setters, audit committees, preparers, and others on the issues vital to our mutual commitment to the public interest. We come at these issues from different perspectives, but we are united in our goals of sound capital markets, investor confidence, accountability, transparency, strong governance, and internationally recognized high standards of accounting, assurance, ethics, and education. When these conditions are in place, capital flows to its highest and best uses, economies grow, and people prosper. There is no better example of stakeholders coming together to renew our commitment to the public interest than Crecer, which year after year attracts the best leaders from the public and private sectors, academia, multilateral organizations, and the broader civil society. As we now gather for the 10th time in 12 years, the GPPC looks forward to another lively exchange of ideas for strengthening the financial infrastructure to enable economic development and growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Enjoy the conference.
Muchísimas gracias. Vamos ahora a dar un recesito de 5
Take
minutos nada más
5-minute
para pasar a
break
la primera
to get
plenaria.
ready
Vamos
for
a
the
hacer
first
una
meeting.
entrevista y nos vamos a ir
We are going
acomodando
to
aquí en
do
donde
it
estamos.
as an interview setting, and we are going to ask Mr. Sacco, Ms. Sacco and Ms. Zavala to come forward.
Todavía no vamos al receso, es
We
solo
are not
5
going
minutitos.
to go to the coffee break. This is just a 5-minute break to get the stage ready.
No. Hola, hola. Ok. Ahora sí, vamos a continuar. Vamos a continuar. Yo sé que quieren hablar muchos de ustedes unos con otros, pero esta parte es muy importante.
É muito importante.
Vamos a tener una entrevista con Sena Busaco, como decíamos, directora del Banco Mundial para Centroamérica, y Verónica Zavala, gerente del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo para Centroamérica, Haití, México, Panamá y República Dominicana. Les rogamos tomar asiento.
Please take your seats so we can start our first plenary of regional
Crescer, habilidade
for regional and economic growth.
During this interview, we are going to be talking about how current economic perspectives can affect the regional growth. We are also going to be talking about priorities and opportunities and challenges. But first, I would like to ask a question to both of you. In your opinion, what is the current economic situation and the forecast that your organizations give for the have for the regional Latin American region? Ms. Ibo, thank you very much, Glenda. It's always a pleasure to be here with Veronica. We believe that growth is recovering. It has been doing so since 2017, but it has been a weak and unequal recovery process. Why weak? Because we have three of the largest economies in the region, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, with a very weak growth, almost negative. In the case of Venezuela, it has almost collapsed. But this means that when we look into South America, we talk about less than half a point of growth this year. But on the side of our region, what we are in charge of, Central America and also the Caribbean, growth has been much more positive, almost 3%, a little bit over 3%, 3.2 for Central America in 2019 and 3.4 for the Caribbean. And this also gives us a scenario in which we have mixed risks and signals. On the one hand, on the shadowy part, we have the acceleration in China and the low price of raw materials as a risk for the region. On the positive side, we all know the growth in the US has been very solid, and this is a good signal. And we have also seen that the Federal Reserve of the US has stopped increasing the rate of the monetary policy, which is going to bring less pressure on our currencies, but also on the outflows of capital. Finally, when we pay attention to all of this, the task or fiscal situation continues being weak because, as I said before, from our 32 countries in the region, 27 are still have a fiscal deficit, which means that access to credit at a reasonable price to good management of the debt is going to continue being important. So a scenario of lights and shadows, but it still is recovery. The direction is goes, and we have to keep it up. Veronica, does the IDB agree with this forecast? Well, at a great extent, definitely. But we have different differences in decimals because economists say that they always have three different opinions when economists are involved. But basically, what Sinabu stress is true. In the region, the average mark great differences. There are countries such as Panama or the DR that have ASEAN growth, and the Dominican Republic 6% and Panama about 5% at the same time. Our countries, for instance, Chile has a very interesting growth, but at the same time, the large economies are showing problems. And also, I agree with Sinabu in the sense that there are external factors that are not the best. In the U.S.-China commercial war, it has influence in the region, although the raw materials price is more stable, doesn't have the interesting prices that usually help Latin America. The interest rates are higher than what we would need, which, and there is another element that Sinabu didn't mention that I would like to stress now, which is the migration phenomena in the region. This is an element that definitely has been hitting us. It has a shine of light because the first that leave the country, unfortunately, are the most qualified. So we can find that there are countries that have benefited from migration, but that as a region as a whole, definitely the dramatic situation in Venezuela and Nicaragua are generating migratory processes. And let's not forget the Northern Triangle with own migratory phenomenon, which makes the region, although they are not macro elements, these are elements that generate an economic impact on the region. Imagine how this affects the public finances that are already tight when they have to receive migrants in large amounts, close to 1% of the current national population, and in some countries above 2% of the country's population, which means investing more in education and health and in infrastructure in general. So this is also an important element. So within this context, how is the IDB and the World Bank getting ready for the opportunities?
Well, I completely agree with that in the macro part, but also the micro. And I agree that the immigration phenomena puts even more pressure. How do we prepare then, Glenda? Well, two ways. First, when we see an environment with less liquidity, we once again must give a greater focus to the fundamentals, the economy fundamentals. And here we're talking about fundamentals in terms of fiscal policies on how to improve income and how to collect more and better, and how to spend in a much more efficient way, and how to better manage debts and take care of all this fiscal part. There's all the structural part. And here we're talking about human capital, which this year has been something huge in the World Bank. And we also talk about competency and also the institutional We have transparency, governance, what we're going to discuss today in Crecer. So this is the first part. Second, we must also say that this year the bank has two things. First, we had an increase in capital, which has been almost historical, which provides much more resources to support countries in the challenges they face in this region. This also allows us to give greater focus to our private sector, the FC, which will be able to do much more things with the private sector, promoting development of the countries of the region and the world. Second, we also had a historical growth in resources we have for the poorest countries. And only for this ADA, we have $75 billion for 3 years. It's a huge qualitative leap, and all this means that it's not only money resources. For us, it's impacts, because this means we'll be able to support the super ambitious agenda the region has for its most important resources, which is to prepare its people, because that's human capital. In other words, you already define where those resources will be invested. Yes, there's priority for human resources, because by investing in people, you can prepare for the future. So I believe this will help us greatly to prepare, to respond to these challenges, and to also leverage opportunities in a scenario where there's many shadows and lights. How about IDB? How does IDB prepare for these opportunities? Quite similar. 175 billion. How much, really? No, we expect to have to remain in the region around 17, $18 billion per year, which we believe it's an important amount. But what Senabu was saying initially, I think, is important. The macro part has to be present. If it's not there, it's very difficult to build. But that definitely is not enough. And we must think that the region has lost competitiveness compared to the world. As far as productivity, we are still behind, and this requires much more investment in infrastructure, also in human capital, but to do it in a more intelligent way. If we see how the region invests, it does it in education a lot, and higher secondary education, when the greatest performance or yield is at the beginning. But somehow our investments is opposite to the impacts. So if we think about infrastructure, yes, it has to be resilient infrastructure to adapt it to climate change. But besides that, to be able, we have to create infrastructure that will allow us to go to the fourth industrial revolution, because we cannot be left out of this. Latin America has been very slow to be part of these different revolutions, but this one has such speed that if we're left out, we'll have the risk of, if we see the average of how much employment can be lost in the future, between 400, 800 million jobs in the world, but there's around 400 million that will be reconverted. So how can we make the employment in Latin America those that reconvert? And for that, we have to invest in our human capital. As Senabu said, we have to be much more, let's have clarity that we have to maintain the macro and be much more intelligent and creative in leveraging the resources of the private sector. That's what I want to ask Veronica. Which are the priorities for the Latin American region in innovation, in technology, and how does IDB respond going forward? I think as far as innovation, we must work in four simultaneous fronts. First, there's infrastructure, connectivity. You cannot think you're part of a digital world if you cannot connect. More than half of the people in the region are outside. So that's the first very important element we must attack. Second, digital transformation. So we need players, infrastructure, technology to be able to be part of the Industrial Revolution. I don't like to criticize other countries, so I'll talk about my country, but it's not very different to the others. In Peru, for instance, there's a great amount of informal companies that are outside, but of the formal ones, 27%, only 27% is betting for technology. So that's a very low number. Third important element, very important, is cybersecurity. Nowadays, cybersecurity is not a science fiction, it's happening. And the region loses almost half a point of GDP in cybersecurity issues. There are under indicators, 49 indicators regarding this. And most of the countries do not reach half of a satisfaction score in this. And finally, human capital. Our human capital is not becoming a digital human capital. Here we have to invest in school, in jobs. For instance, with cybersecurity, the region has a deficit of 140,000 professionals in cybersecurity. Imagine all the different elements and how does IDB, part of this? 140,000 is our deficit in cybersecurity. Yes, we need cybersecurity everywhere. And we see it as an accessory, but this is very expensive. So how do we work with this? Well, with technical knowledge, with training, with operations, with funding, and in general, we, with the different instruments the bank has, with knowledge, financing, finding successful experience, and for countries to learn about these. For instance, 10 years we have participated with Uruguay, who has had great advance. It's a country in Latin America as part of the digital cell. Besides that, it's a very generous country with its knowledge, but also bringing other experiences like Estonia. It's a country that's been able to double its GDP per capita by means of very clear digitalization policies. So we need the region to have access to those roadmaps and to that way of closing these gaps and becoming players. I think it's possible. The important thing is to believe it's possible, as Uruguay has done, as Chile has done, and in general, the countries in the region. Costa Rica, for instance, has human capital, which is very easily to think it could take that leap. But it's not the only one. I think it's an opportunity for all. But the important thing is to have that roadmap, and as they say, as the engineers say, as a rule, those who know copy, and who don't, they invent. And I think in this, the bank could have an important role to bring in better practices and also to inform what routes are not the best. In the case of World Bank, how do you approach this phenomena that is a revolution? I completely agree with Veronica regarding the digital part. In the bank, we call it the moonshot, because when we wanted to reach the moon, we had to do many things at once. So there's not only one route, there's many things to do alongside. And just to add, we must see this also in the region, for it's an opportunity. For instance, broadband networks, all these innovations we must see regionally, not only country level. And let's not forget the local level, because you cannot develop nationally without the local level. And many times municipalities forget and to speak about innovation. What we are doing at our bank is precisely that, to see how we can learn from more successful experiences and how these can be applied to a more local level. And just, for instance, to think that innovation is not only in information technologies, but also in models that are able to attract private financing in the public sector. We did this in 2 cases, and many, but I think that's very interesting. Colombia and Costa Rica, where we have what we call budget support, to support structural reforms to help the session of OECD for Colombia, and also to support climate change, to have a bond that could transfer the risk of natural catastrophes to the market to support the peace process. So this is something very different. This is not something that's the digital part. It's related to many things, but each country, this is the way things are, and also try to leverage social media, how a transparency agent can carry the voice of civil society and also the voice of the private sector in one same place, and how we can use these things as transformation agents. So there's many things to do, but we also must do these things in a structured manner without forgetting the different levels in which we are acting. And once I was told that orange is the new blue. And I said, what is that? What does that mean? Because they're saying that this part of the economy, the digital creativeness, is the orange economy. And now it's more in than blue economy, where it speaks only about the fishery sector. That's just a way to illustrate. But I think we'll continue having a country with orange, blue, and green. But the important thing is to continue innovating. Thank you. I would like to share that we had a survey in Twitter of the World Bank regarding what the participants believed of what is required to attract more private investment. And I would like to share the answers. What was responded regarding what is required to attract more private investment? Well, 43% say or responded stability. Economic stability is required. 32% legal security or compliance. 14% said clearer rules. 11% answered accountability. So I repeat, 43% economic stability, 32% law compliance, or 14% clearer rules, and 11% accountability. And this was a Twitter survey to attract more private investment. Do you all agree? Well, I think yes and no is my answer. Well, yes, macro stability. Without that, there's nothing. But definitely it's not enough, as we said previously. We need stability, but we also need the conditions to improve your competitiveness, productivity, infrastructure, human capital, so on and so forth. What's the other element? Law compliance. Yes, I think law compliance, a rule of law is something very important. But also, we also need to review our laws. Many times in the region, we have laws that could be stable over time, but are not the ones that will allow us to take the leap. We not only should have stable laws and compliance, but it has to be an attractive legal system. And we have started seeing that countries are finally competing to attract resources which are scarce. So we'd have to make sure that laws are compliant, but also to have laws that allow these to be attractive for investment. And these laws have to be well aligned with the objectives of improving productivity and competitiveness. Accountability, I think this is a group that has answered more sophisticated than the user doesn't usually say accountability, but I think this is very important. Nowadays, with all the corruption scandals we've seen, not having a good transparency framework, integrity framework, good integrity practice, becomes a very strong negative. So I think accountability should have to have a greater percentage. Only 11% said accountability. So yes, it's difficult because the macro has to be there. But yes, accountability has to have great strength, but not only being accountable, but also having that transparency framework, integrity that would prevent resources to go where they shouldn't. and above all, for the citizens to be engaged. Each corruption scandal detracts investments for years. It kills thousands of jobs and affects the GDP. So it's a very important element beyond any headings in the news. But you see the Bahat, all the papers in Argentina, and all these are blows to growth, but also to governance. Senator, what do you think about this survey, about these results? I'll be brief. All the above. It's enough, but it's necessary, but it's not enough, and only choosing one will not fulfill. So I want to choose all, but it's not enough. We have to use these in such a way that they can respond to the challenges that countries are facing. So one is not enough. Which is the most important one for you? All. It's like when you're cooking. Salt doesn't have a weight, but it resolves a very important part for flavor. So all the above. Very well. Well, thank you very much. And I thank both of you for providing your views, for your prognosis for the coming years or for next year, and for sharing the opportunities in this current revolution of innovation, of technology, the challenges, and especially the investment in human capital and the resources available. Very interesting. I think that as a journalist, we should publish those open fields more, talking about cybersecurity and more training for that. Is there anything being done in that regard as far as cybersecurity? We would like tech to do that. Well, a round of applause for both. Monica Zavala and Senabu. And now we'll continue. And we'll ask Senabu to remain because she'll be now the moderator for the second part of the first plenary. And the next topic is public-private partnerships and challenges for regional integrity. And we'll ask the following panel members to please join us. And as I was saying, for this next segment, the moderator will be Senabu Sacco. And the following panel members will join us. This is Rocio Aguilar, Minister of Finance, Costa Rica, Jordan Schwartz, Infrastructure Director for APPS and Securities World Bank, Kenneth Flo, APM Terminals Director, and Shirley Saudio, Executive Vice President, the Competitiveness Promotion, Costa Rica. So we ask you to please take your seats. And as I said, the moderator will be Senabu Sacco. Good morning, and I would like to welcome this panel. And we will open with some thoughts right after this discussion we had right before the Q&A. First, I had two main reflections before we begin, and just to provide a context to this discussion. Well, first, the APPs in the regional context, what are we talking about? And according to a World Bank study, Latin America is behind compared to other regions in the world in terms of investment for infrastructure. As Veronica said previously, here we're talking about 180 billion when governments cannot invest a lot as far as it's part of its GDP in moments in which the growth of this GDP is still not big. So here we're talking about close to 4.3, numbers are 4.3% of GDP, which is required when only less than 3% is invested. And when this is compared to 7.7% in Asia, it's like the chicken and the egg or the hen and the egg issue. What comes first? We have to invest much more to close the gap and then to have a much greater GDP and then be able to close a virtuous circle to compare to where we are now. Second, we see that this investment in our Latin American region and the Caribbean is very unequal. For instance, we talk about 1.5% in Mexico and 6% in Nicaragua, but we know that Mexico's GDP is very different from Nicaragua's. But the efforts are different. And also, the studies show that the APPs are 40% of the investment in infrastructure in the region and mainly funded by private banks. And this has allowed to increase the infrastructure in the region through the investment of the private sector, which is today's matter. The second reflection is that despite all its advantages, and I know the minister referred to this, the APPs require significant challenges in its funding, structuring, and implementation for which the countries require to be prepared. Only one thing, when we speak about funding, we're also talking about financial sectors and markets, capital markets, which are not very mature. This is another issue the region faces. The other part is preparing or studies, preparing or training. And Dr. Jordan knows this, and this is also a challenge for a region. Finally, in our region, we have many weaknesses in the regulatory framework and in the institutional capacity. And this all says that the countries are preparing APPs without speeding up the projects or without having the institutional capacity or nor the budget. And this I want to give as a context before we begin our questions. And I'll begin with Minister of Finance of Costa Rica, Minister Rocio Aguilar. In your opinion, what is the main challenge Costa Rica has in structuring APP projects, and how this challenge is relevant for the region as a whole? Yes, you just made an excellent review of challenges and obstacles. I would say that with Costa Rica, that started in 2000 with a very important portfolio of projects in sanitation, jails, and roads, ports, airports. I think it found a number of obstacles to carry out these projects. And I believe that one of the most important things is a very complex legal framework we developed. And of course, weak institutionality. These two things are fundamental pillars for PPPs to see the light of day. We need projects that are duly structured from the technical part, legal part, environmental. But above all, we need bankable projects. And I believe that one of the obstacles we have encountered with some projects that were able to overcome a number of obstacles that are added in the journey was the bankability of these projects, which we should not leave aside. Costa Rica urgently requires to advance. And this very big deficit it has in infrastructure. The levels of deficit and debt we currently have will not allow us to do this with public resources. So it's highly important for us to do away with those obstacles, not only overcome our fiscal deficit, but also the institutional deficit that is a great part of what I would highlight. The country cannot undergo concessions where a government comes and gives support and not the next one, because here we're talking about projects very long term where what is required is decisions. So we have an institutional inflation, huge additional regarding these projects, where in some opportunities, at least 30 institutions have to participate for one of these projects to see light of day. So I think it's there where we have to work. And the fundamental thing, we need to reinforce the institutional capacities to, in fact, have the best counterparts in these projects. We know how complex they are, and we shouldn't forget that difficulties the country has for development of public works is not eliminated magically when what we are facing is concessions. More than likely there we will see it much more, because different from projects that could spend 10 to 15 years from its execution from the state, and when we have is a private one on the other side, it's impossible, and it becomes over cost, which will end up in higher rates, which will be even more difficult for users to advance in these projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've listened to bankable projects to strengthen the institutional framework, but also adapt the time frames between the short and long-term liability management. When we talk about projects that may last 15, 20 years if the governments don't have the continuity. And it's the time for us to talk with Jordan. Jordan, you're working globally. What can we learn from the global experience? We've listened to the case of Costa Rica, that's a flagship in the region. But what can we learn in terms of how to favor, how to strengthen, how to promote investment in PPP? I'm going to try to answer in Spanish. But I'm going to be looking at the faces in the audience, and if they're making faces to me, I'm going to switch to English. And I'm going to do it in Spanish because we're in this beautiful country. When we look at the figures, the data that we have on the success and failure of projects, for the closing of funding, and we look for the variables. I think one would think that the important variables are the complexity of the projects, or the sector or subsector or technology. But what we see is something less sexy and deeper. the levels of investment, the quality of investment, and the possibility of having a cancellation will depend on the treatment of sovereign risks. In other words, the predictability of the contracts, the way they're handled, to protect the interest of investors and consumers, the capacity of regulatory entities and their interdependence, the transparency of the processes and transactions, and the repetition of transactions to have the probability of cancellation of a failure is much bigger if the country has different transactions in the short term. So we learn out of experience in the transparency of processes and the regulation of the process, so much so that the basic element of the contracts continue being as the most important part. That's what we've seen everywhere, so much so that in the region that we work, in other regions where we work. So sovereign risk, the way to promote interest and the capacity of regulatory entities and process transparency. And if we go from Costa Rica to a global level, let's go to Kenneth and look at the Moín container port. It's recognized in your countries and in the world as a success case to potentiate private investment through an increment of connectivity almost at a global level. In your perspective, what have been the ingredients that have allowed you to have this success, and what have been the key factors for this project to be able to be achieved? I believe it's a big question. The first thing, as Rocio mentioned at the beginning, is public-private partnerships. So I believe you begin choosing your partner, and we ourselves, when we think about whether we're going to do our own business, our own personal business, and we want to get into an industry or project that is complex, the first thing we ask ourselves is who the partner will be, what will they contribute. So one of the key elements for the choice for this project to move forward was to have this partner, to have APM terminals with this experience around the world, not only to be able to see and have access to a lot of resources, but being a terminal operator and recognize, as we've said sometimes, that the sins that are committed when constructing one of these projects are paid through the project of depuration, and the blessings are enjoyed through this time. So first of all, you need to have this important partner that has the knowledge and that contributes and provides value added to the projects. Secondly, transparency. There's been a myth in our country that a public-private partnership or a concession is a political value where the wealth of the country is being exploited. We're working together to make countries grow, to develop the countries so that our economic growth is bigger in the future. And it seems to me that this has been an important element to have the support of the government, to be totally transparent and demonstrate that a project of this nature that is so big and for so many years has this condition. It's been transparent all along. It's met all of the requirements, and it's made this project possible. And the last thing that is very personal and has to do with the attention of what's been mentioned, that there's some of the problems, and the only way to overcome these problems is to be consistent and perseverant. And in this case, APM terminals and the project have been of this nature. They've persevered in attending and looking for the licenses that were required to operate, to comply with all of them, to assist different regulatory bodies, to understand it was an operation that didn't exist in the country under these conditions, precisely for us to understand what was missing. This took up time and resources, and it seems to me this perseverance is necessary in our countries, because we'll always find that private terms in private companies are very different from the terms in the political sector. And the way to land the project is to have this consistency and transparency all along. I believe we've heard much of what's been said in other sessions in terms of transparency, government support, but also consistency and persistence that are necessary to innovate, because it's not something that we have a pattern of. You have to invent it and see what's missing. But what I'd like very much is putting back again in ATM that they're partners. It's not always one side against the other. They're all partners to meet an objective, the public and private working together. We always have to put it back again on the table. Surely, it's nice to see you again. In the Council for the Promotion of Competitiveness that you represent today, how has the appetite of investors evolved in terms of participation in PPPs? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Costa Rica in general, and that's what Madam Minister said, and she was the first technical secretary of the Concession Council Costa Rica had. And Doña Rocio has huge experience, and it's a guarantee today, because at the end of the day, there's always been appetite. Costa Rica has the right environment to generate these partnerships. Unfortunately, we don't have many good experiences. I think we can harvest a lot better. Doña Rocio said we begin with water, jails, some national roads that didn't exist, airports, ports, and then when you think of a country like Costa Rica with its privileged geographical position that may have a development in infrastructure that is much higher, it's complicated. However, you don't have to be so negative. When you think about the concession of public works, you have to think about 2 or 3 good examples. 27 highway APM terminals, thank God it's a reality. It's a very good experience. We also have the Juan Santamaria International Effort, and we have other experiences in terms of PPPs. And let me mention some of the good examples we have. The Institution of Electricity in Costa Rica ratifies the law that allows private generators to have a share in private generation. Through private contracts, the operation of BOT plants, build, operate, and transfer plants are used. And these are operations that are in place, that are being carried out, and that can be much more ambitious, having a policy of decarbonization that is so aggressive, but that works at the end of the day. The other example that is absolutely successful, and at the council we feel that's how things are built, because as Don Kenneth says, it's not one against the others, but we're all pushing together, trying to do things. At the council, it's private companies that we always try to collaborate with public entities to try to make the difference. But a very successful model we have is Procomer. The promoter of foreign trade is a winning story for all. No one in this country thinks about whether we're in agreement with trade opening. The board of Procomer is in the private sector. The manager is not in the civil service. but they allow them to be the best, and they have an insured budget. Who guarantees this budget? It's not the Ministry of Finance, but free trade areas that pay fees. So we can do much better things. There's appetite, of course. What's missing? Many things, and we can talk about them, but it's, as Doña Rocio said, an institutional framework that is very complex and an institutionality around concessions that is very weak. And we can talk about this, but of course, we always have a lot of appetite. I believe we've seen it because of the position with investors. The issue of power generation is a great opportunity Costa Rica has. Investors ask, do we have to create a better environment. We have a nice climate as the happiest country in the world. We have good tourism. We have a good reputation in a few things, but bad reputation for others. And that's where we have to improve in terms of the investment climate through PPPs that may be beneficial. Thank you, Shirley. I believe we all have to learn quite a bit from these valuable experiences that are the successes and failures. The World Bank is also learning a lot, and also talk about the key role the Minister of Finance plays in this. We've worked a lot in the regional framework to see how we can transfer everything we've discussed at a regional level. The Minister Council in Central America, we're trying to see how to respond to issues like infrastructure, road connectivity. And this demands a level of coordination at a regional level, a PPP level that is difficult at a national level. Putting it regionally, it's even more difficult. So my question for the Minister of Finance is, how do you see the coordination mechanisms that currently exist to be able to create regional PPPs? Recently, we were discussing this topic, and I believe whether it's regional or local, the pre-investment stage is very important. And oftentimes we get embarked on a project without having completed the pre-investment stage. And so this makes that the problems that should normally be solved in this stage will have to be solved when we got started with the project, and we come across expropriations, relocations of services, and some other issues. So we were saying how at a regional level where we've identified a series of projects, it's important to have the necessary resources to be able to successfully complete this stage. And we were also talking about the generation of a fund to be able to fund at a regional level all of these projects with the same standards and quality, the same vision, and not projects that are in excess or lacking in one country or another and that won't achieve the objective of integration. And that they can be resources that once the project is landed, they're reimbursed to the fund in such a way that they keep feeding projects that are going to be necessary. Fortunately, at the level of Josefine, they've identified the project, and the next challenge is to see what's the status in each one of the countries, whether it's in electricity, highways, and the dry corridor, which is a very important demand in the region, to be able to complete the studies, and that once these studies are taken forward and when the feasibility it's been determined and also supported along the process with the right structuring, so that when they're launched to the market, they're projects that are positively received, where hopefully there's competition and we don't find that there's just one bidder in these projects, understanding that there are going to be projects that, apart from supporting the complexities each country has to solve them, they're going to have to look for regional institutionalities, if applicable, to be taken forward successfully. But definitely, and that's how I discussed the issues that the region is still lacking. They're exacerbated because of immigration issues, that if we can't complete the infrastructure to be able to return to each one of the countries in the region the necessary competitiveness, it's going to be a problem that will become more serious with time. Thank you, Madam Minister. And we have a leader in this topic in the region. And let me say that pre-investment, as well as having the same quality standards, the same institutional framework, paves the road. I was in the Honduran dry corridor, and needs can be solved only at a national level because this is something they need in the region. Climate change is a global challenge more than national. And that's why with Jordan, what have we learned in terms of success of PPPs to strengthen regional integration or regional projects? In one sense, it's a very easy answer because the minister has explained perfectly well that what we've seen, basically, there's not so many cases of contracts in and of themselves that cover more than one country. In buying and selling power, but also in the funding of the transmission projects that cover 2 or 3 countries. It's been difficult under a contract. In the transportation corridors with services, the operation of the railroads, but infrastructure has been difficult because of the actions described by the minister. Basically, if we have different markets and we have a way of designing contracts and to provide the risks of the contracts that are different among countries, it's very difficult for investors to look at a project and say, I may have a country with three parties or more. And that's why the most important thing to create markets from the perspective of funding and investors is, Kenneth, what's important is to arrive at a point where contracts and the way we're dealing with risks is similar among countries, and that the entities, the institutions, treat investors in a way that they protect contracts and consumers feel fine. So it's the same issues at a national or regional level. Maybe more challenges, but it's the same issues. Something that is also regional in the development of financial markets and capital markets in small countries, as we have in Central America, but in other parts of the region, it's been a development agenda in the long term. Kenneth, based on your experience, how accessible, how easy it is to access these funding sources to implement ATP, and in particular, what's missing to improve this access to financial markets? It seems to me that with such a large project like ours, it's complicated to have access to the necessary funds in the local market. It's so much so that it's a project that's been funded with own funds that originate in Europe. So if you ask me, do you have the facility? What we've seen is that because of the amount of these projects and the regulations that exist in different countries that limit the amounts according to groups of economic interest, we're seeing that it's difficult to have this access to these banks locally and that such a project can be funded. Definitely, it's the case of the terminal, but there are in other related projects that I think are easily bankable to the extent that there's concrete rules. And this is what Doña Lucia mentioned, when there's a government that supports and that on the next day, the next government goes against for any bank taking into account the investment terms, this generates instability. So the first thing you ask in the bank, do you have a projected cash flow? How real is this cash flow, taking into account that through the investment period we're going to be talking from 6 to 8 different governments? And this is where the instability comes up that we need to try to regulate so that we can have the chance to offer these projects in a feasible manner to banks. What I've heard again is bankability, bankability. I like easy bankability, and also to see what specific and foreseeable rules. And we would like to say then that the public sector has lots to do and institutionalize to provide this previsibility to the private sector. Surely, when we talk about PPP, we're talking about how to transfer risks from the public to the private sector and the other way around. You never know who's transferring more risks. From your perspective, how do you perceive in the private sector the risks of implementation of PPPs? And what are the asymmetries that we see in risk perception in both the public and the private sector? It seems to me that because of the experience that we have and based on what Doña Rocio and Don Kenneth mentioned, the most important risk when doing such a project is legal uncertainty. If we're convinced or not that this is the right track. The other question is who's convinced, because in the end we found the APM project, and correct me if I'm wrong, you went through different governments, Doña Laura, Don Guillermo, and it's finished in this process. But the truth is it was torturous. I can say, for instance, that President Solis, without having won the election, I was the director chamber of the chambers, and out of these topics, which do you think we can reach an agreement on? And he said, definitely not concession. So at the end of the day, it's very complicated when you face changes in political direction, because nothing is bankable if we don't have political certainty and legal certainty. We've found extraordinary people and we're working very well in some projects, and then there's a change in office and people change. And beyond the financial, environmental, social risks that can be, it's more of an issue of legal certainty and the political decision. Are we truly convinced? And then who are convinced? Because at the end of the day, as financial entities, you're looking to fund projects that have good success in the long run, and you finally say what's going to happen. We have the history of Highway 1, that the process got opened and then the government backtracked. And so it seems to me the biggest risk, and what we believe in the Council of the Promotion of Competitiveness, is there's no secure competitiveness if we don't have political certainty and legal certainty that we're convinced. The minister said, and I can't be in more agreement, it's not government policies but state policies. The success CINDE and Procomer have is that they've transcended the governments. At the end of the day, nobody's thinking about whether we agree on attracting foreign direct investment or not. If we're going to stop exports, nobody's questioning this. But for instance, concession of public works for Costa Rica has been satanized by several groups, and the benefits haven't been actually transmitted the way in which we can have quality infrastructure, the competitiveness we can bring, and all of the surrounding investment, socioeconomic development in the area. These are all important issues on the table. So beyond the specific risk and who assumes more risk, it depends on whether we have a Congress against us and groups against us. The biggest risk is assumed by the President of the Republic if we wanted to start from here. Today, more than ever before, we have the right environment. There was a decree drafted in 2016, but nothing has happened in regards to this decree. So we have the right environment, we can move forward much faster, but we have to improve our institutionality in the regulatory framework because this gives us certainty. And then the other thing is we can't go back. The issue of local government is not a smaller issue. Such a small territory like Costa Rica, so many local governments, when it has to go through 2 or 3 different locations and we face different regulations, it's very complex. So in the end, we have to convince middle management in institutions that are the ones that remain to create the right environment on the benefits of investments and for whom. Thank you. State policy, long term. I think we have a lot to learn from the experience of Costa Rica in terms of institutionality, how agencies can help in this process, and then to say when we have to say who has to convince. The private sector is not just people. We have civil society, legislative, executive, so the challenge is big. But the word for each panelist, what I'm going to ask, what's the role of multilateral banking to assist promoting PPPs in the region? It's the same question to all panelists. I'd say the role of the banks, and in particular that have supported the country here, has to do with institutional capacity. Number 2, how to fund the previous stage, the pre-investment stage, so that we take out the most robust and bankable projects, so that when this project sees the light, we can find the counterparty of banks, the private banks, really interested on these projects. Of course, the other important part has to do with the capacities of the country, where we have projects with the right distribution of risks, and those risks that should be taken by the government, and that the government should keep, that they have the certainty that these are risks that will mitigate or will be met by the government. The support in taking 1 or 2 successful projects forward, and by successful we mean what there is an offer and interest to take them forward, and also within reasonable time frames and not in the elastic times our projects use, is another element that is important. I have the confidence that the country may take that jump, not because we have the Jesuit conviction that part PPPs are not only necessary, but because We don't have the public resources to substitute the private sector. In Costa Rica, we've lost a lot of time in this subject matter, and I believe that what corresponds, it's hand in hand with multilateral banking. We can take the next step and continue on the right track in terms of PPPs. Not all solutions are found in the law. We are prone to looking for solutions in the law, so that in the end, if the law is not enacted, it's a problem of the law. And if it was, it's because I did it very well. So we really need to break the myth that everything has to be solved through a new law. There's an issue with decision, willingness, state support as a whole, so that these can be moved forward. Shirley was mentioning the case of a decree. By having a legal framework that was good, that guarantees the investor that it's a law, we looked at creating regulatory framework at a lower level to simply not use the word concession and talk about PPPs as if in this way we were going to hide the fact that on the other side we're going to have a private party. Who's going to believe in a decree to invest in a country at a term of 30 years, a decree that can be changed at any moment by an administration? So I believe that the legal framework is important, but beyond the legal framework, we need to have the institutionality and mostly the support and the convincement that the only way the country can stop this strong delay in infrastructure is with the support of the private sector.
How do you see the role of the multilateral banking in this process? And is it going to be an inside point of view? Well, maybe I completely agree with the minister. These are the roles that we play, but just to mention also that we also have resources to finance the preparation of projects, the feasibility studies. The governments and different administrations come to us and want to finance projects quickly. There are counterparties, there are investors that are pushing to come into a project, but they have not really undertaken feasibility studies. They have not considered the social and environmental impacts, for instance. And suddenly what we see when we are in a hurry, when we are trying to push in for a particular project, but we have not really done the prior work to prepare the project well, projects end up having problems. Or when the project, either at the closing of the project or even worse afterwards, when the project has already been, has progressed. So this is another area where we can support. I would also like to mention that when we look at this globally, we have data to see what participation in the funding is received from institutions such as ours in different PPPs. And we have noted about 50% of PPPs in debt come from the public sector. This is a way of reminding ourselves that these are true partners and that we are sharing the risks in every way. And very often the funds come from either directly or indirectly from multilateral institutions. Almost 40% of the projects have direct participation from one of our institutions in one way or another. We can also offer collateral and other forms of support to the country government commitments if the market believes that the government commitment is not enough given the capital cost that the project might need. We have either the IDB or the World Bank or MIGA. We have several kinds of instruments that can support governments to close the deals for projects and attract the investors according to the capital cost when it is favorable. Something else that is important is that we're here to support especially policies and trying to share experiences at a global and regional level that we have engaged in. Probably this is the lesson, most important lesson, that we are partners in all of this. Well, thank you very much. Kenneth, what is your opinion as to the role of multilateral banking? Well, definitely, I have to see it from the private sector perspective, and I believe that you were the one who said or who mentioned an important aspect for the future of these projects that has to do with emphasizing on intelligent investment. I think that by default, the multilateral banking is allocated a role to try to understand where these investments match, where these investments are part of a development plan that I think would also help align the deficiencies or differences with the national institutionality. If we have a development plan that tells us where these projects match and where we are heading strategically as a country, definitely, even when the project changes, we will have their clear direction. As an example of private company, a company such as Amazon, its growth has a north, and time can go by and they can change CEOs and managers in different departments and move a little bit to the left or to the right of that direction, but always having a final goal. And this is what the bank should assisting the different governments to understand exactly where the projects match at a national level. For instance, our terminal, into what part is it in terms of the development of Costa Rica, and also at the regional level, because as part of these intelligent investments, when we are talking about large infrastructure investments, we have to talk about scale economies, and we need to use these as a region. If we view the map, we realize that Central America, a whole of Central America, is much smaller than Mexico. And just taking this into account, we should wonder, is it necessary for us to have so many small individual projects when we could actually be thinking about regional works? Kenneth, in your opinion, Shirley? Thank you, Kenneth, for your opinion. Shirley, your closing remarks. What is the role of multilateral banking in this? Well, thank you very much. I believe that beginning right here to talk about the benefits of PPPs, not all projects or concession and a partnership is not privatization. Remove myths, start educating and creating culture inside public organizations. This is a relevant topic, but also it's important to identify opportunities. And multilateral banking, you could help guide governments, especially when we are talking about long-term projects and governments are in office for shorter periods of time. So being able to identify what the opportunities and benefits are for the medium and long term, I think that the role of the bank is very important beyond the implementation process of the project, because when projects are already there, the most important contribution is the seal of guarantee. It is really, the risks are not very high, but all these kinds of things could help for the prior phase in which we are when we talk about this, when we talk about the projects. So this could be a project that could be are object to a PPP. We should identify the environmental and social benefits, because this is also important to be stressed. And I think the support of the transfer of knowledge and leverage of the different political realities are very important, and multilateral funding organizations have played a fundamental role in this sense. Well, thank you very much. I believe that I agree, especially on what you said about talking, educating, removing myths. I believe that our conversation today is part of this effort also to realize what we can do not only at a national but also at a regional level to truly incorporate these scale economies little by little. Now, very quickly, some conclusions of what we discussed today. What I have heard is the pre-investment phase and preparation of the projects, having 1, 2, 3 successful projects at a national or regional level to showcase what can be done. Second, thinking about the legal certainty and long-term commitments, that we should have a government of the a government commitment, but a state commitment that can remain over time. Finally, we also have to think about increasing the quality of the project preparation and allocate risks properly. This is going to be an essential step. Also, we need to improve the profile of the institutions and manage the PPPs. And finally, if the law is not everything, we need to improve and strengthen the institutional and regulatory framework. I think that at a regional, national, global level, this is a challenge, but it is a necessary challenge, because without this challenge, we cannot close the gaps that we have in infrastructure, and we cannot comply with the global development agenda. Thank you very much. Please just remain a little while here. I would like to ask Veronica Zavala to come to the scenario before going for the coffee break. We are going to take a picture, and we are going to deliver a token of our appreciation. And we would like to ask Xiomara Morel. Let's give her an applause. Manager of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. We would like to thank her and her team for organizing this Congress, and also to Deborah Spitzer, who is a leader specialist in financial management and acquisition operations for the Inter-American Development Bank. Let's take an official picture, and then you have time for a 15-minute coffee break.